Samuel Lorn's farm. It should have been a morning like any other, quiet, predictable, shaped by the rhythms that carried him through a war he never fought but felt in every corner of his life. Yet something unsettled him before he even reached the barn. A sound, faint and irregular, drifted through the cold air. It wasn't the thump of livestock or the scratch of raccoons. It was softer, almost cautious, like footsteps afraid of being heard. Samuel paused at the barn door, hand resting on the worn latch. The boards creaked, a familiar complaint from old wood. But what followed was not familiar at all. A muffled gasp, and then stillness so absolute, he wondered if he'd imagined it. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, instinctively narrowing his eyes as they adjusted to the dim interior. Dust hung in the slanted light, moving slowly, as if trying not to disturb whatever secret the barn had decided to shelter. A moment he saw nothing unusual, just his tools, the empty stalls, and bales stacked neatly from the previous week's labor. But then, behind the grain sacks near the loft ladder, a slight shift betrayed the presence of something alive. Samuel's pulse quickened. He had dealt with stray animals, curious children, even a pair of traveling salesmen who slept off a drunken argument in his hayloft. But this was different. This movement had purpose, fear, and silence behind it. "Come out," he said, voice steady from habit more than confidence. "I can hear you." A long pause followed, stretching thin across the barn. Then a figure rose, slowly from behind the sacks. A woman, thin and pale, with hair pinned back in a way that suggested carefulness rather than vanity. Her hands were raised slightly, not in surrender exactly, but in a plea for calm. Behind her, two more shapes hesitated, a teenage boy with shoulders too square for his age, and a younger girl clutching a frayed SATCHEL. Samuel froze. Their eyes told him everything before a single word was exchanged. These were not trespassers looking for mischief. They were frightened, desperate, and foreign in a way the war had taught Americans to fear. The woman spoke first, her accent unmistakably German, but softened by exhaustion. "Please," she whispered, "we mean no harm. We only needed a place to stay. Just for a little while." The barn suddenly felt narrower, its winter drafts biting harder. Samuel's mind raced through the landscape of recent months. Newspapers filled with grim photographs of Europe's ruins. Radio broadcasts about displaced families wandering through wrecked cities, and the persistent warnings that enemy aliens, documented or not, were still subject to detention. Even after surrender, rules barely changed. Fear had a long tail, and it still whipped through American towns like an invisible storm. "How did you get here?" he asked, though the answer seemed almost too impossible to imagine. The boy stepped forward, jaw tense, as if protecting his mother and sister had become his only identity. "A ship," he said. "It was supposed to return to Europe. But it didn't. They said there was confusion, papers missing, people misplaced. We had nowhere to go." The mother gently touched the boy's arm, guiding him back. "Hamburg is gone," she murmured. "Our home gone. Someone told us America would send us back once things settled, but we were separated from the others. No money, no documents. We walked, we hid. We followed the fields because the roads had too many eyes." Her words carried. No theatrics, only the tired cadence of someone who no longer expected sympathy. Samuel felt a twinge in his chest, not pity exactly, but recognition. He had a son still stationed overseas with occupation forces, sending home letters filled with cautious hope and quiet frustration. The boy before him could have been his son's age had the world turned slightly differently. War had a way of rearranging children into men and mothers into wanderers. "You can't stay here," Samuel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "People talk. Strangers get noticed." "We know," the woman replied, her expression tightening. "But we needed one night out of the cold." The young girl clutched her satchel closer, as if it held every piece of the life she had left behind. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "We tried to leave before dawn, but we heard someone coming. We didn't want to frighten you." Samuel exhaled slowly. The danger pressed in around them, an unspoken reality neither side needed to elaborate. If he reported them, They would be taken for processing, possibly detained for months. If he didn't, he risked accusations of harboring enemy aliens, a charge that still carried weight despite the fading echo of war. Outside, a crow cawed sharply, breaking the tension for an instant. Samuel glanced toward the open door. A neighbor's truck could appear at any moment, and the entire situation would spin beyond his control. The family sensed it too. The boy stood straighter, the mother's eyes flickered with dread, and the girl's grip tightened. Samuel rubbed a hand over his face, trying to steady the turmoil inside him. He had lived through a war without firing a bullet, yet here he stood confronted by 3 survivors of its aftermath, expecting judgment from a man who knew the cost of being on the wrong side of suspicion. "You're hungry," he finally said, surprising even himself. "Sit tight. Don't move from this spot. If anyone sees you, I can't help you." Hope flickered across the mother's face, tentative, fragile, as if she feared even gratitude might break whatever mercy she'd been offered. The boy nodded stiffly. The girl whispered a thank you, barely audible. Samuel turned toward the door, every step heavy with the knowledge that compassion could cost him dearly in this uncertain season after victory. Yet something deeper, older than politics, pulled him forward. Responsibility, perhaps. Or the simple recognition that war didn't end just because newspapers said it did. As he reached the threshold, another sound drifted from behind him. The faintest shuffle, like someone preparing to speak but losing the nerve. He looked back. The boy met his gaze, eyes steady, and said quietly, "We will not forget this." Samuel didn't answer. But as he stepped into the pale morning light, he understood one thing with unsettling clarity. Whatever happened next, he was already part of their survival. And somewhere beyond the barn, a disturbance in the stillness suggested that others might be closer than he realized. The chill of late afternoon settled over the farm as Samuel returned to the barn, carrying a basket of food he hoped no one had seen him prepare. Shadows stretched long across the wheat field, merging with the quiet tension that had followed him since the moment he discovered the German family inside his walls. The land had always been honest with him. Sunlight meant labor, storms meant worry, but now every shift in the wind felt like a warning. He stepped inside, letting the door ease shut behind him. The family looked up from the corner where they huddled, their expressions balanced between gratitude and dread. Even in the fading light, he noticed how the mother's hands trembled, as though holding a fragile thread that kept her world from collapsing. He set the basket down gently, trying not to appear hurried even though every instinct urged him to keep moving. "Eat," he said quietly. "You need strength." The boy gave a nod that was more a promise than an acknowledgement, while the girl's eyes widened at the sight of bread and apples. The mother whispered her thanks, but Samuel didn't linger on it. He listened instead to the distant hum of a truck on the county road, the rustle of the rafters, the barn's old bones settling against the cool air. Each sound became a reminder that discovery could be moments away. He leaned against a pillar, studying them with a careful neutrality. They did not look like the enemy he had been taught to fear. They looked like people who had run out of places to go. The mother's posture held the stiffness of someone accustomed to bracing for bad news. The boy watched the barn door with the alertness of a sentry. And the girl, though trying to appear calm, stared at the cracks in the floorboards, as though unsure which direction the world might tilt next. Samuel felt the familiar weight of responsibility, pressed deeper, heavier than any harvest he had ever hauled from these fields. The mother began speaking softly, her voice threading through the barn like a confession. They had left Hamburg after the city collapsed under months of hunger and rubble. The harbor had been chaotic, she said, with ships rerouted, officers overwhelmed, and passengers funneled into vessels with little record-keeping. The transport they boarded had been meant to return them to Europe after a temporary detour, but once at sea, plans changed. When they docked in America with incomplete manifests, officials grew suspicious. Families were separated for questioning. Some were detained, others were misplaced in the confusion. The mother had grabbed her children and fled before authorities could sort their names into a category. Samuel listened in silence, the gravity of her story settling around him. He understood the fear of governments making mistakes, He had seen neighbors investigated during the war simply for having German surnames. He remembered the county meetings where citizens were told to report anyone unfamiliar. Even now, months after victory, the echoes of those warnings lingered. He rubbed his palms together, trying to warm them, but unease had already seeped under his skin. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, followed by the unmistakable rumble of a tractor heading toward the property line. Samuel stiffened. "Stay quiet," he whispered, moving to the small window near the loft. The machine crawled along the neighbor's field, its driver scanning the horizon as though searching for something out of place. The boy moved closer to his mother, shielding her without hesitation. Samuel felt the scene carve itself into his memory. 3 shadows pressed together, waiting for judgment they couldn't predict. The tractor eventually turned away, but the interruption confirmed what Samuel had feared. People were watching more closely than usual. He returned to them, lowering his voice. "Neighbors have sharp eyes around here. They notice things even when they're not trying." The mother nodded slowly, understanding the warning beneath his words. The boy's jaw tightened, a reflex of someone who needed to appear braver than he felt. The girl clutched the satchel again, as though it might anchor her to something familiar. Samuel exhaled, wishing the world operated with clearer lines. He hadn't asked for this burden, yet fate had placed it in his hands with an unspoken demand for decency. "I can't let you wander," he said after a moment. "You'd be seen. And if you're seen, someone will call the sheriff. Not out of cruelty, but because that's what we were all told to do." His words hung thick in the air, carrying the weight of a truth none of them could escape. The mother swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as though trying to push back tears. "We will work," she said. "We will earn whatever we take." Samuel shook his head, though not unkindly. "Work isn't the issue. It's the risk. If you stay, every day becomes a gamble." The boy stepped forward then, shoulders squared with a resolve that seemed older than his years. "Give us a chance," he said, "just until we know where to go next." His voice didn't tremble. It carried the steady determination of someone who had already lost too much to fear another loss. Samuel studied him closely, seeing in the boy a faint reflection of the courage his own son had written about from overseas, the courage born not from glory, but necessity. The light in the barn dimmed as clouds gathered outside, casting the interior in muted gray. Samuel felt the day closing around him, pressing him toward a decision he had been trying to postpone. "All right," he said finally, "but you must stay hidden. If anyone comes by, you don't make a sound." Relief softened the mother's face, though exhaustion still clung to her like dust. The girl allowed herself a small breath, almost a smile. The boy gave a solemn nod, as though sealing a pact. Samuel gathered the empty basket and moved toward the door, each step echoing louder than the last. As his hand touched the latch, a flicker of movement near the window caught his eye. A figure stood at the edge of the field, half obscured by the wheat stubble, watching the barn with a stillness that sent a shiver down his spine. The sun dipped lower, hiding the figure's features, but not the intent. Someone had noticed something, and now the shadows on the wheat field no longer felt like tricks of evening light. They felt like a warning he could no longer ignore. Winter crept into the valley with a quiet persistence, frosting the fence posts and turning the wheat field into a pale, brittle sea. To Samuel, the cold felt sharper this year, not because the temperature had changed, but because he carried a secret that seemed to steal his warmth each day. The German family remained hidden in the barn, moving like whispers through the dim corners, careful not to disturb even the dust. Every morning when Samuel opened the door, their faces held the same mixture of hope and apprehension, as though they expected to be discovered at any moment. Their presence had woven itself into the fabric of his days, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Like a shadow following too closely, the boy whom the mother finally allowed Samuel to call Walter took it upon himself to help with chores despite strict instructions to stay unseen. Samuel would find small signs of his effort. Wood neatly stacked, tools wiped clean, a wheelbarrow moved without explanation. The work was competent, even thoughtful, as if the boy wanted to repay a debt too large to express through words. The girl lot drew pictures in the dust with a shy artistry. Small sketches of birds and houses she quickly erased whenever footsteps sounded. Their mother, Clara, spent hours mending torn clothes or patching loose canvas, her hands methodical, her eyes heavy with a weariness that seemed permanent. Samuel found himself speaking more with Clara, though their conversations were brief and measured. She told him bits of Hamburg, how the nights glowed orange from fires that never seemed to die, how the city cracked open under air raids until the street maps no longer made sense. She talked about ration lines, missing relatives, the silence that followed combat, as though the world waited to see if anything human remained. Samuel listened, not as a judge, but as someone trying to understand the residue of a war he had only witnessed through distant newsreels. Her stories carried no dramatic embellishment. The truth didn't need any. It clung to her voice as tightly as her children clung to what little hope they had left. But outside the barn, pressure mounted. Neighbors stopped by more frequently than usual, some curious, others restless with the shifting pace of post-war life. One man mentioned seeing movement in the field at dawn. Another joked that Samuel's barn looked busier than normal. Even casual remarks made Samuel's stomach tighten. The man he'd spotted days earlier standing at the edge of the wheat had not appeared again, but the memory of that still figure haunted him. Paranoia or not, the farm felt watched. Samuel's cousin, Henry, returned from the war that month, drawn and restless, carrying the invisible turmoil of a man who had seen too much. He visited unannounced, offering stiff greetings and long stares. Henry walked with the rigid caution of someone expecting danger behind every door, and his ears were unforgiving when it came to German accents, something he had learned to detect with instinctive precision. When he lingered near the barn, Samuel found excuses to draw him away, all the while feeling sweat gather beneath his collar despite the cold. Late one evening, the sheriff's truck rumbled down the lane, headlights bouncing across the uneven ground. Samuel met him on the porch, heart thudding in its own desperate rhythm. Sheriff Doyle was a decent man, slow-speaking, observant, and respected. He carried authority lightly, but thoroughly, the way a plow cuts soil, without force, yet leaving nothing untouched. "Heard someone's been prowling near your fields," Doyle said. "Just checking in." His tone was friendly, yet Samuel sensed the subtle probing beneath it. Doyle had a way of reading people, even when they stood silent. They talked about livestock, weather, and returning soldiers, but Samuel felt the weight behind each casual question. Every pause threatened to tip the balance. In the barn, Clara and her children would be perfectly still, holding their breath until the sheriff's engine faded into the distance. Samuel imagined their fear, the tension that must coil inside them at every unfamiliar sound. And it struck him how much of their lives now depended on his composure. The next morning brought trouble in the form of footprints, small ones leading from the barn to the well. Lot had ventured out during the night, perhaps thirsty or restless. The prints were faint but visible enough for someone paying attention. Samuel crouched over them, heart hammering. The snow was light. By noon they would vanish. Still he felt exposed. When he entered the barn, Clara knew instantly something had happened. Her face drained of color, and she gathered her children as though bracing for a blow. Lot apologized in a trembling voice, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Samuel placed a hand gently on her shoulder, telling her she wasn't in trouble, but the moment left a ripple of shared fear that none of them could shake out. As days passed, Samuel's internal conflict deepened. Each small act of kindness tied him closer to the family, yet each risk tightened the noose around them all. He thought often of his son, still stationed overseas, writing letters filled with cautious optimism about rebuilding efforts. The war had ended on paper, but its ghost lingered everywhere in returning soldiers, in fractured families, in policies slow to catch up with humanity. Samuel wondered what his son would think if he knew his father was sheltering the very people many Americans still distrusted. One night, when the frost fell heavier than usual, Clara spoke with a quiet resolve Samuel had not heard before. "We cannot stay hidden forever," she said. "Soon someone will notice something we cannot explain." Samuel didn't argue. He already knew the truth of her words. The farm had become a delicate balance between compassion and danger, and the balance was thinning that before dawn. Samuel woke to a faint creak outside the house. Not the barn, not the wind, a deliberate footstep. He rose, heart racing, and moved to the window. A silhouette approached the barn door, slow and purposeful. Whoever it was, they weren't wandering aimlessly. Samuel's breath caught as the figure lifted a lantern, illuminating a familiar face, one that made his stomach tighten with dread. He recognized the person instantly, and the implication hit him harder than the cold ever could. Someone he trusted was about to discover everything. Henry's lantern cast a wavering glow as he approached the barn, its light trembling across the snow like a warning Samuel wished he could ignore. The morning was painfully still, the kind of silence that demanded truth, not excuses. Samuel hurried toward his cousin, each step carving anxious prints into the frost. Henry stood rigid, eyes fixed on the barn door with the sharp focus he'd carried home from battle. "Thought I saw someone out here last night," he muttered. "Didn't look like you." His tone wasn't hostile, but it carried the weight of memories that still stalked his sleep. Samuel forced a laugh, claiming he'd been checking the animals, but Henry's expression didn't soften. The barn creaked faintly, a whisper of movement too soft for anyone but a soldier to notice. Henry's hand drifted toward the latch, instinct rising faster than reason. Samuel stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his arm. "Let me," he said, keeping his voice calm, though tension pulled at every word. After a brief pause, Henry relented. Samuel slipped inside, blocking the view, heart pounding as Clara and her children huddled motionless behind crates. He spoke loudly about feed and repairs, hoping the forced normalcy would muffle their fear. When he stepped back outside, Henry studied him with unsettling clarity. "You're hiding something," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just recognition. Samuel met his gaze, offering a thin version of the truth. Travelers, hardship, people caught in the cracks left by war. Henry listened, jaw clenched, but finally nodded once. He wouldn't interfere, not yet. The lantern's glow faded as he walked away, leaving Samuel suspended between relief and dread. In the following days, snow buried the fields, muting the world into something gentler, though tension still threaded through the air. Clara moved with more surety now, stepping closer to the barn door when Samuel arrived. Walter worked diligently on small tasks, careful but determined to contribute. Lot began humming soft melodies that drifted into the rafters like fragile reminders of hope. Despite fear, the barn was warming into something resembling a refuge, but danger crept in subtle patterns. Footprints appeared near the well one morning, small, unmistakably Lot's. Samuel erased them quickly, but anxiety rippled through the family. Clara apologized with trembling hands, though Samuel reassured her gently. The fragility of their arrangement sharpened his awareness of every sound, every shadow that drifted across the fields. Peace, he realized, was a bargain with conditions none of them fully controlled. When Sheriff Doyle returned, Samuel's pulse quickened, though his voice stayed even as the sheriff climbed the porch steps. Doyle mentioned displaced families moving through nearby counties, some seeking shelter, others detained unexpectedly. His tone was weary, not suspicious. He asked if Samuel had noticed anything unusual. Samuel walked a tightrope between honesty and protection, speaking vaguely of travelers passing through, of people trying to survive winter's unforgiving grip. Doyle studied him for a long moment, then offered a quiet mercy. These months after a war are messy. If someone needed help, I'd hope they found it before the wrong eyes showed up. His words felt like a blessing wrapped in caution. That evening, Samuel returned to the barn with a warmth he hadn't felt in weeks. Clara read the shift in his posture instantly. When he told them the sheriff wouldn't trouble them unless circumstances changed, her shoulders sagged as though a piece of her burden had finally loosened. Walter let out a slow breath he'd been holding for days. Lot smiled, small, fleeting, but genuine. They shared a simple meal together, gathered around crates arranged like a makeshift table. Lantern light brushed their faces with a quiet gentleness. Walter asked questions about crops and machinery. Lot giggled when Samuel bungled a German phrase. Clara watched them all with an expression that blended gratitude with awe. For a brief moment, the war felt distant, and the barn felt almost like a home patched together with fragile trust and borrowed peace. Yet outside, the wind shifted. As Samuel stepped into the night, the distant grind of an engine rolled through the valley, slow, deliberate, unfamiliar. Not the sheriff's truck. Not a neighbor's pickup. Something heavier, moving with purpose along the frozen road. Samuel froze, breath hanging in the air, understanding instantly that whatever fragile sanctuary they had built was about to face a test none of them were ready for. He turned toward the barn, mind racing through contingency after contingency. If the vehicle belonged to federal officers, there would be no time for explanation, no room for negotiation. Clara's family would be questioned, processed, and likely detained before sunrise. The thought tightened Samuel's chest. He had given them shelter, not because he sought to defy the law, but because he recognized humanity where others saw only remnants of the enemy. That recognition had grown into something steadier, a responsibility he could no longer shrug off. He walked back to the barn door and pressed his palm against the cold wood, listening to the faint sounds within, soft breaths, shifting straw, the cadence of people trying their best to be invisible. They trusted him, perhaps more than he deserved. The engine drew closer, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow in beams. Samuel stepped into the yard, forcing his legs to hold steady. The sky hung low and gray, wrapping the landscape in silence, pierced only by the approaching vehicle. He glanced toward the house, where a single lamp glowed behind a curtain Henry had left slightly open. If Henry woke and saw the lights, suspicion would ignite all over again. Samuel stood alone between the barn and the road, a solitary figure racing against an unseen storm. As the vehicle crested the final rise, he straightened his spine, knowing the moment had come when his choices would be weighed against forces far larger than one farm.